Hello, everyone. So we're about a minute early, but I'll get started. And if you have any extra time, you can just leave it for Q&A. So nice being here. My name is Ihsan. I'm the Chief Product Officer at OpenBB. Don't mind the long titles. I'm basically here to announce our latest open source product on stage. And before we go there, so maybe let me just introduce OpenBB to everybody if you're not familiar with it. So I know GitHub stars a bit of a vanity metric, but according to at least that one measure, we are the world's most popular active open source repository under finance topic. So if you're familiar with, if you remember those game stock saga days, meme coin, so all that good stuff, 2021. So that's how OpenBB got started. It was originally called, very jokingly, the Game Stonk Terminal. It was essentially for all these techies who suddenly got interested in the stock market. They're trying to deal with financial data. They have no experience with it. But, they got this very fresh approach that, okay, let's try to come up with an open source toolkit to unify, standardize all of these different data sets that we suddenly, very quickly learn how to deal with, like news feeds, Reddit, Twitter feeds, market data, and things of that nature. Let's try to come up with a framework to just put everything in one together in a CLI terminal type of interface. There was no workspace, no AI, none of these things. It was a pure data engineering toolkit. So Gab talked about this in the FINOS keynote yesterday. So we're a commercial open source company. So we got eventually funded by some VC firms who wanted to commercialize and build things on top of this open source platform. So now we're wearing suits. We renamed it to OpenBB, not GameStonk. We got quite serious. Now we're dealing with hedge funds and buy side and sell side and whatnot. But the core of what we're trying to do hasn't quite changed. So at the end of the day, our open source toolkit is still for data engineers, but now we think of it as it's for data engineers and developers who work at financial institutions or developers who are dealing with large scale financial data sets. With the following thing in mind, though, like it's not an engineering tool for you to monitor your data pipelines and whatnot. It's really with the mindset of you're a developer, you have these potentially non-technical end users in mind, some analysts, portfolio managers, managing directors and whatnot, and you're trying to make your pipeline very quickly accessible, useful and insightful for someone who's on the other side, get to minimize that time to insights essentially as a developer, right? So that's what OpenBB is still working on. Let me just show what the framework is about. So essentially, the goal always was that you're trying to integrate these data pipelines into one standardized, unified Python library where your final end user can just basically download pipistrel, OpenBB, my awesome extension. They're abstracted away from all the ETL process and things of that nature. That was the original use case. Like imagine that you're trying to deliver data to a team of quants. You don't want them to essentially deal with and be super involved in where the data is necessarily coming from. The framework can handle any sort of data living in any place. We're completely agnostic. We're not trying to sell data or anything of that nature. But from the original use case, over time, we run into other use cases from the community, right? So it's not that just like I'm trying to serve a data scientist and quants or, just basically can work with a Python package. But let's say that I integrated my data into this framework. Now I want to serve it into a web application. What if I want to serve it into a dashboard? Okay, so then we added support that, look, you've done all the hard work of adding your data and building a data extension into this framework. Then we're just going to try to make it very, very easy for you to essentially expose the data extension with one line of command as a fast API server. And you can deploy it wherever you want, right? So we have our own commercial solution as like a dashboarding tool, and we give a free tier for developers to test their work. But that's actually optional. At the end of the day, you get a fast API server, you can do whatever you want with it. And then LLMs became a thing. Everyone was talking about, I already did this hard work of using this framework, putting all my data pipelines into this OpenBB package. Can I give access to a copilot or an agent as an MCP server? So now we added a support, purely open source. fast MCP support that would just give you, turn your data extension into an MCP server running locally on your machine, or if you want to deploy it some other machine, it's up to you. One line of command, now you can essentially connect it to a Copilot, any Copilot who supports function calling and tool calling type of functionalities. And then we run into, okay, so I have analyst colleagues, they work in Excel. I built a data extension here. Can I serve this data to Excel, right? So then we come up with a solution for that. We created an OpenBB Excel plugin. So you already, again, done the whole work of putting your data pipelines into this framework. We don't want you to spend more time essentially creating these plugins and whatnot. We just basically make it very easy for you to essentially just serve the data through a secure server with a certificate so that your Excel using colleague can essentially access it with few lines of code. So the developer could do all of these things already. So what is new? So what is new is this piece. So this piece now is that you no longer need to be a developer to do that very final piece. We're now giving you an open source Tauri app. It's a desktop application, runs on Mac, Linux, and Windows. So once you download this from the same OpenBB repository, this desktop application takes the part that you need to run a lot of these commands on the command line and whatnot, now just turns into a point and click that even a minimally technical person could essentially handle. So the way that this works is, I'm going to show you a very short video what it does. But so once you build your framework with OpenBB as a Python package, so what this says here is environments is essentially creates, you point to those folders and it would create a mirror image environment of your extension. So it could be something that we develop, so you can just basically clone it from the community, or it could be your own private data extension that you have built. So we basically just treat them as environments. So you can basically have as many environments as you would like. If you're using Poetry or something like that, for instance, the end user can visually see all the packages, can update them and do things with them and so on and so forth. So from the environments, what do you do under backend? So what backends are now about is that you just basically point to an environment that this desktop app recognizes, and with few point and click, all that talk about the fast API server, MCP server support, and things of that nature. So now it's just point and click. You just need to say that, look, I want a backend application that uses a following environment. Here are the executables that I want you to run. We give you some basic tooling around scheduling it, auto start, refresh, and things of that nature. And I was supposed to talk about this in the earlier slide, I forgot. But we, as a sort of like a principle, we try to incentivize people to run things locally at the start. Because the use case here in this developer community is that don't try to prematurely go into cloud and how you're going to deploy these things and things of that nature. So OpenBB is most helpful to you at the start in that research and fast prototyping phase. So it's by default is going to try to run these things in the single machine. Like so if I turn on my own OpenBB instance, like you're going to see that I have 10, 20 applications running, everything just running on my local laptop. So you have the option to go down the Docker road and deploy and everything, but like at the start, OpenBB is just going to basically give you that local environment. So the good thing about the local environments is that, notice here these API keys. So if you have 5, 10 applications running, everyone codes their credentials in a different way. So you're looking for config files left and right. So what this application also does is that if you add the environment to the app, to the desktop app, it will essentially dig through all these environment files and consolidate them under one tab. So you can essentially see all the local credentials, API keys, and whatnot. If you use OpenBB's credentials facility, everything is stored locally. We're not collecting any usage data. There's no connection to cloud and things of that nature. So everything is running in your machine locally and securely. So that's sort of like what we want to prioritize. So if you want to go into production, let's worry about that later. This is a great tool if you're a developer and you're just fast prototyping things. Also, another great utility that we found from the community, like, you know, these pain points that the developers have, people have a terminal hell. So if you're running essentially 10, 20 applications in a certain place, then you lose track of like which terminal window is doing what exactly. So if you're doing If you're using this application, so now all the logs are essentially consolidated in one place. So all the monitoring, scheduling, and whatnot, you can essentially do it here. This desktop app is also open source. So it's basically the idea here is that we open source the application so that if you want to build more applications into this, more extensions and whatnot, so the community is going to be in charge of this. For example, to start, we added a little Jupyter icon that if you would like to run a local Jupyter server specifically for this environment and the extension, we already support that. That was just meant to be an example. So if you want to launch a cursor window for your application, the open source community can develop these type of things over time. So all these applications, all this framework could be extended. So we know, for instance, that there's an interest in the community to essentially provide, like, this is all designed to run locally, but there's some interest in the community to essentially add a plugin to get things to Docker Compose quickly. Just one button, write the Docker Compose file, and it will try to deploy this into some other machine and things of that nature. So these are all the reasons why we essentially open source everything, because we can't keep up with every demand. So we try to build the framework and let the community essentially build all the nice extensions to it. So let me see, am I doing on time? So I'm going to show you how this works in a little video, and I'm going to talk through it. There's no voice here, so it's by design. So this is basically, we're launching this today. So this is basically going to where to find it. So if you just go to OpenBB homepage, it's going to take you to our GitHub where you can download the latest version of this. So this is basically showing you when you first launch the application, how the OpenBB core environment is going to be built. So let me just pause it here. I just want to briefly talk about the extensions. Okay, so right here, so, oh, sorry, this is blurry. Okay, so when you first install the application, it will only install the core OpenBB packages. So then it says that, look, you basically have a choice to decide which extensions that you would like to get. So you can think of extensions as all the private data source pipelines and things of that nature that you have. So OpenBB, since we know from the community like what some of the important public open government data sets that all the investors are already using, so we have built some of these extensions, or people from the community has built and contributed to the repository. Things like, we're just going to show an example with the FRED, for example, right? So we have integrated FRED. So this is, in case you're not familiar with it, this is the Federal Reserve API stack. It's a very commonly used data set. So we created an open source package around FRED and integrated to OpenBB. So you can essentially choose these things and install the things that come from the main repository. You can directly install it if you would like. But the idea with the extensions is that you're going to have your own private extensions coming from your own data pipelines. Let me continue the video here. Okay, so now this has loaded some of these environments. And then you see here, I'm just basically, all right, let me just pause it here. Give me 1 second. So here, we got this main OpenBB application in the example. So the executable is essentially, you type it in the configurations saying that, look, use OpenBB's own API executable, which essentially gives you support for fast API. So you can flag where you want to run it, which ports, use, we give you gazillion different flags and whatnot. So you just basically run the application from here. Then we just want to show you how the credential facility works. So in order to run FRED, you need to have credentials for the application. So, so in this example, my colleague is essentially going through these things, and once you add your environment, if you use the credential facility, it would recognize that in order to run this application, you need a key, and that's what it's called. You just basically copy paste it here, and then it's going to work. So this piece is the commercial component. So I just want to stop here for a moment. So the desktop application is now giving you a fast API server. So you can do whatever you want with that fast API server. So our commercial product, which is not all fully open source, is a dashboarding tool that comes with a Copilot. So since we know the protocol between the fast API server and how to render the data on our own OpenBB workspace, when you connect that backend from that desktop application to OpenBB workspace, this is the experience. Like, you just basically go here and say, This is the URL I want you to recognize. Here's the name, validate it, and if everything works, your data, your server has 306 endpoints. Every endpoint now has become a widget, a tile in your dashboard, right? So as a developer, you don't need to do anything, right? So it just basically gives you this fast prototyping tool. You already integrated the data. If you copy paste it and run it from the desktop app, you basically get a dashboard for free. And once the connection is made, let's say you go back, your colleague asks you to create some new endpoints, you basically create that extension in code, you go to the workspace and do just right-click, refresh my backend, you just get another tile in your dashboard. So essentially, it's a great tool for developers as they test through these things and don't worry about where they're going to deploy it, how beautiful it's going to look and things of that nature. They can essentially get a dashboard very quickly without doing any extra work beyond the creating the extension. So it's not in this demo, but one final thing. So you get the same facility now with the MCP server. So if your goal is, I don't care for a visual representation, but I want, let's say, Claude to have access to my data extension as an MCP server. So you can basically do the same. I'm going to show you the example from my own local machine. So I'm running the application here as an MCP server. And all that you need to do is go to MCP server configuration, add as a new server, and now your data pipeline is essentially accessible to the Copilot. You can prompt it, and you can access it that way. So there's plenty of other applications. I'm going to stop here. Here's how to reach me. Let me leave with this slide over here. I'm just going to leave it for questions.
So I do believe that this is a good tool for helping people get on board with Python. A lot of people, financial analysts who use Excel, they think in their head, oh, I'm not a programmer, that's too advanced for me. You know, Excel formulas are programming language now. So, but if you have advice on how to kind of encourage analysts to adopt Python more, so these kind of tools.
I mean, I guess when it comes to very low-tech Excel using analysts, the use case for the desktop app is essentially that I was briefly showing it on the screen at the time. So all that you essentially need to do, I mean, we can't remove all the steps, but what we make it quite easy now is that with the desktop app, all that the user needs to know is how to clone a repository and edit. And once they do that, if they don't have any kind of coding experience, there's a little button I was showing here earlier on the slides with generate certificate. So the generate certificate is essentially to serve the data over a secure server that is Excel compatible. So all that the user needs to do is that, look, someone else develops the extension. You just basically add it through this desktop, generate a certificate, open it up in OpenBB plugin, and you're going to access the same data your developer has done without any kind of coding. So you can pull the data with just using Excel commands. Yeah. If there are no other questions, we can end it here. Thank you so much.